Hello listeners, welcome to episode 3 of season 5 of the Offshore Wind podcast. My name's Stuart Mellin. I'm the Chief Industry Officer at the Global Wind Energy Council, and I'm joined at the desk by my co-host Rebecca Williams. Rebecca, welcome back to your second or third episode as our actual co-host on the Offshore Wind podcast.
Thanks, Stuart. Bedding in now, got my feet under the table, ready to go.
You've actually had a busy few weeks in the lead up to this. You've been in Japan and Manchester. We've launched the Global Offshore Wind Report. How's everything going?
Yeah, I've kind of come to you in a slightly exhausted yet happy fashion, having been on my grand tour, my Taylor Swift-like grand tour of the world, launching the Offshore Wind Report. So as you say, I was at Renewable UK's Global Offshore Wind Conference in Manchester. And then I hot-footed it to Tokyo to launch the report also with METI for our Japanese stakeholders. And then finally, I crowned it by going to Glastonbury Festival. So there was many comparisons made between the Renewable UK event being the Glastonbury Festival of the wind industry, but then I finalised it all by actually going to Glastonbury. So yes, coming to you happy but somewhat exhausted. I think though the key learning from this trip was just that, you know, there was a huge reception for the Offshore Wind Report. I think it was absolutely the right decision to take that report on the road and get it straight to the heart of the policymakers who we really need to influence with the findings of this. So I'm really pleased with how that went. We also had colleagues launching the report in China. So Feng Zhao, our head of market intelligence, was in China launching the report there, and obviously our CEO Ben Backwell launching the report in Busan, South Korea. So a full team effort across the world there.
Yeah, it was fantastic to see on the social medias. In today's episode, we're going to have a look at the skills gap in offshore wind and how do we actually face some of the challenges around the skills gap. And to help us have that conversation, I'm very pleased to introduce Ayleen Sadvakassova. And I know that I've got that name wrong, Ayleen, because I've practiced many times and I've told you at the start I'm not going to get it right. So I'll just call you Ayleen from now on. And she's the NES Fircroft Regional Business Development Manager for North Asia. Welcome, Ayleen.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting to be part of this conversation today.
And joining you from the NES Fircroft side is Niels Mellin, who's NES Fircroft's Regional Business Development Director for Renewables with a strong offshore focus. Welcome, Neil.
Great, yeah. Thank you, Stuart. It's great to be here and to discuss some of the challenges being faced in the offshore wind sector right now.
So, from an NES Fircroft perspective, how are you guys seeing the development of offshore wind around the globe?
The wind of change are blowing quite strong in APAC region. So we definitely can see more and more countries besides China are stepping up and embracing offshore wind as a clean energy source.
And Neil, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's been actually quite a challenging year. 2023 moving into 2024. I think that obviously whilst offshore is no longer just a European, Chinese, American story, I think that it's been a real challenge with some policy and regulation issues, permitting slowing down projects, and grid connection issues.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that across the world. Those grid connection issues are really challenging. But then, given that observation, you've kind of got sort of like growth on one hand and challenges on the other. From your perspective, and attracting like talent into the industry, how this is a pretty difficult time, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think some of the policymakers, we've seen that the UK government has initiated an £800 million in funding to support allocation round 6. I think it's really important that the developers, the governments, the policymakers all get together and have a clear strategy. 2023 did see a lull in projects, and that will have put people off joining the industry and moving and transitioning their skills from the traditional energy mix of oil and gas into the offshore wind sector.
And from your perspective, Ayleen?
In APAC, I would say it's a mix of positive and not as positive news. In Korea, we has recently set a new energy targets for 2030. We can see in Australia awarded the feasibility licenses for over 12 gigawatt of projects. Taiwan concluded finally the significant auction. So definitely at the same time, we see some challenges on the market.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to jump in there, because this is obviously a strong theme of the report that we just brought out. I mean, we're going to dive into that in full detail. Don't worry, listeners. We'll go into the very detailed grains of the report when we do another episode on that shortly. But I guess from our perspective, we see maybe a bit of a disconnect between where the market feels it's at right now, which obviously in your line of work is a really important kind of measure or mark. How do people feel about the industry versus what the data is actually telling us? And I think this came out for me very starkly when I was on the road with the report, that actually when we look at the outlook, when we look at what's happening in the market, it is a really positive picture. So we see a lot of growth in the new markets in APAC that you were just mentioning, Ayleen. We have seen challenges for sure, as you point out, Neil, in some of these key markets, like in the US and the UK. But actually looking forward, we see this huge global growth. So I think it's great that we can have this conversation today about how we scale up our people power in order to meet that growth. But I totally agree that at the moment that we have this kind of challenge where maybe how people feel is not in step with what the numbers are telling us. So I don't know if that's something that you're seeing come through in the conversations that you're having from a kind of recruitment perspective. Is that something that you see?
Yeah, very much so, Rebecca. I think I also attended the Global Offshore Wind Conference in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, and probably saw you around home, the event, right? Somewhere. Yeah, exactly. And the messages from developers, the messages from the potential future government, it's all very, very positive. It is all, this is going to happen. Offshore wind is part of the energy mix. We want to grow this to a 2030, 2035 target. But actually, when you're talking to individuals, they're looking to transition into the market, they're a little bit fearful around, are those promises going to be delivered? Are those projects going to happen? I will go back to AR5. There was no offshore wind projects in the UK. Some of the AR4 projects yet haven't achieved financial investment decision. So if we're not aligned with the government, the developers, the policymakers, we will not get the skills to transition into the market to then deliver the future growth that we need within offshore wind.
And maybe just throwing it to you, Ayleen, because obviously I was in Japan in the last weeks, and I think there are some unique challenges, let's say, when it comes to the Asian perspective. Obviously a very new industry for a lot of countries in the APAC region, some of which have the oil and gas heritage, some of which do not have that oil and gas background. So do you feel the same about this from the APAC perspective? How do you see the similarities and differences in tone?
Yes, definitely. For example, if we're talking about Taiwan, we have this number of projects awarded during the 3.2 auction. But when you talk with industry professionals, you can see that maybe not all of them will gonna be financially viable and will gonna go forward. In terms of like Japan as a market, indeed, we also can see that recently they awarded some floating wind development projects, for example, right, which is very exciting for the region because it's something definitely not financially viable, but as well, smaller scale, it's a little bit of the demonstration projects at the moment.
I'm glad you mentioned the floating things and the floating situation, and that there are demo projects. I mean, we've seen demo projects in floating offshore wind for the last, well, I've been in the industry for 20 years, and I think that they were almost starting. I think the high wind demo started back in 2011, 2012, or maybe even earlier. And we've been going around the margins for such a long time. I mean, how do you actually get people to be excited about demo projects and things where we're not scaling up? I mean, and given that we're going to have like a rush, and given that there are more and more markets where floating's becoming a thing, that'd be really interesting, where we're actually trying to target a subsection of a skill set as well to specifically deal with the challenges of floating offshore wind.
Yeah, I think if within the floating offshore wind, you're right. I mean, there's only been the relatively small demonstration plant facilities. We believe or understand that Greenvolt, a UK project, part of the Intog round at 560 megawatt, they have their full planning, all approvals secured. So I think in the UK that may be the first larger scale floating offshore wind project. And in terms of the people, it may be an easier transition. We will need naval architects, mooring engineers, those skill sets that were traditionally within the oil and gas sector, to transition into the floating offshore wind sector for sure. But we need to see one of these projects, these larger scale projects, deliver. I think that will give people confidence about the future of that sector.
Intog is about this kind of synergy between oil and gas and offshore wind, right? And I think that's a really interesting point also from the perspective of skills and transition of workers, and how we see kind of workers fitting into both industries. I was having a few conversations recently about oil and gas, people from an oil and gas background, and how they kind of view the opportunity and challenge in the offshore wind space, and the similarities and differences in those industries. I mean, is that something that you discuss a lot with people who are kind of on your books? How do you see this journey between the two industries for people who have been in the oil and gas sector?
I think from my viewpoint, Rebecca, and talking to personnel working in both sectors on a daily basis, I think there's a lot of similarities between an offshore oil and gas project and an offshore wind project. It may not be as complex and complicated and technically challenging as an oil and gas, and have the same risks associated with that. But the skills required, like, a foundations engineer is the same for an offshore oil and gas platform as it is for an offshore wind HVDC substation. It is very, very transferable. Yet when you talk to some of the developers, the first thing they ask for is offshore wind experience is required. And we need the developers to also be on board to realize that there is a lot of transferable skills that can move into the sector.
While we're talking about that, what about the pay packet? Are you going to take a hit on your pay on your hip pocket?
I'll say, Stuart, at this minute in time, once a project has achieved a financial investment decision and it moves into manufacturing fabrication, the rates are very comparable. There's not a lot of difference between an oil and gas rate and an offshore wind rate. So I would say that no, people moving sector wouldn't see that as a hit on their pocket. It's just getting that opportunity to move sector when developers are requiring the offshore wind experience.
Are you seeing that the same way in the
So,
APAC area? Sorry, Ayleen.
Sorry.
Yeah, were you seeing that the
Yes.
same as
Yeah,
IPAC?
definitely. Yes, definitely. And salaries and packages are reasonable and good. We just need to stop comparing them with the high oil and gas salaries. That's it. And in terms of the transition from one industry to another, so in my point of view, it's more about the transformation of your mindset when you have a decision to move from one industry to another. But otherwise, in the region now, we have a lot of GWO training centers, as well different kind of programs, and to support professionals from oil and gas mining to transit to sustainable careers.
Ayleen, what about in countries that don't have that background in oil and gas? Because I think in the APAC
Yes.
region, I mean, there's countries that have oil and gas capability, but there are also countries who perhaps have strong maritime characteristics but don't have that oil and gas history
Yeah.
of regulatory management and workers. How do you see that challenge in those countries where there isn't perhaps that oil and gas experience?
Yes, definitely, especially in Taiwan. So, for example, in Taiwan, we not only don't have the oil and gas, but as well, big part of population has a higher education, and they are not interested in manual site technician works, for example, right, and work offshore. From our perspective, we really have to be very, very proactive when we do search and selection and how we attract people for this type of roles. So usually we use former military, or as well, sometimes it can be even high building window cleaners.
Mm. And I'm just thinking, there's a lot of countries in APAC that have a very strong, as I'm saying, kind of maritime sector. So either through shipbuilding or through providing seafarers or fishing industry and backgrounds. Are those also skill sets that you can work with?
Definitely. And for example, South Korea, once the offshore wind gonna go forward, it would be much easier because they have required infrastructure in terms of the fabrication and as well the port infrastructure. So the process would be much easier than what we had in Taiwan.
I think this is also something that GWEC's looking at from a kind of regional collaboration approach. How can we view the region and view the comparative strengths and weaknesses of each country's kind of offer in making this kind of more collaborative approach to pursuing offshore wind in APAC. So good to know that you see those sort of different strengths and weaknesses coming through in different countries.
Yes.
So, from a regional perspective, or do we, or maybe from a global perspective, how do you see that transition of, or is it easy to transfer people from not just the oil and gas sector, but from country to country or within regions, etc.? I mean, I know that in Europe, for example, where offshore has sort of blossomed from day one in the North Sea. It's up until maybe Brexit, it was fairly easy to get people in and around. I mean, you didn't need to do any visas and stuff. But I mean, now, do we have like a shortage of talent in areas where we're developing, are there sufficient pipelines to allow that talent to grow or to transfer from Europe into other regions? How do you guys deal with this sort of transfer of skills?
For now, Asia Pacific is heavily rely on European expertise. That is true, but at the same time, Taiwan as the most developed market in the region, also start to build the pool of local talents. And I do believe that Taiwanese talents going to be required in Japan, in South Korea, in Australia. So we can definitely see that it would be more and more collaboration between countries and more mobilization required.
Why do you believe that you're going to need Taiwanese talent in those markets? Is that just in the initial market startup phase, or is this something that the Taiwanese are going to be really good at? And also, I mean, and are these sort of like fly in, fly out, like FIFO type arrangements, or are they sort of more permanent? Like, are they sort of train the trainer arrangements where you expect these people to be moved in for a start of a project, they train the local talent pool and then move back to their own countries? What's that sort of work? How are you seeing that?
More of the expertise in offshore wind. So this is what is lacking in other regions because they are in the beginning of the process.
Okay. And Neil, from your perspective, how have you seen that transfer of skills around Europe? And have you been privy to moving some of those people into other markets?
Yeah, I think, as you say, with the free movement of labour across Europe, it's obviously much easier for someone from the Netherlands to work in Poland or Denmark. But what we've seen with UK and European projects is the utilisation of global manufacturing and fabrication facilities. I think there's been some constraints on the supply chain, and we're seeing more and more packages of work go to China, go to Indonesia, go to Thailand, Singapore, and at that time it is the utilization of both the local workforce that may have been engaged on oil and gas and other energy projects in those same facilities, and then the redeployment of some senior stakeholders' skill set from UK and Europe into those locations as well.
Maybe just coming back then to a theme that you introduced at the beginning, Neil, you were saying that it's imperative that governments and industry work together to to have visibility of pipeline, basically, is what you were saying, and in order to realize projects. And I got from you a bit of a sense of frustration maybe about the lack of project progression. So from your standpoint, from the NES Fircroft standpoint, what can governments do and what can industry do in order to ensure that they have the right talent in the pipeline to satisfy the demand that we see? Because you were just saying there around supply chain shortages, right? In GWEC's work, we see actually quite stark situation that we might be entering relatively quickly around the availability of supply chain components. And this is giving us a lot of kind of cause for concern and pause for thought. It's something that we're very actively working to try and address. So from your perspective, I mean, how do you see this? How can governments and industry work together from the talent perspective to make sure that we avoid these kind of bottlenecks in the talent pipeline that we have? So it's a question to you, Neil, and then also to you, Ayleen.
I think that's it's an incredibly challenging question. I think just to touch on the supply chain and the challenges that we could be facing, monopiles, there's not a huge amount of supply chain that can manufacture and fabricate monopiles globally. There may be 2 or 3 locations in China, there's a handful in Europe, but then companies are reluctant to invest to build new facilities because the projects aren't progressing as quickly as they'd like to. Is that a economic factor? Is the return on an investment? Is it government and policy and permitting? And then from a person perspective, you see the reluctance to jump out of one sector into another because that lack of project pipeline. I think we've probably picked up on 4 different challenges all in one sentence there.
Yeah, well, we like to confuse our listeners by throwing all the challenges at them at the same time. So but I think the common theme is certainly around, the need for clarity, right? So that people can plan their investments, whether that's from the supply chain perspective or whether that's just people trying to plan where they want to make their next career move.
Of course, from a staffing perspective, and we may have a team of individuals that have worked on a project in China, and then there's no projects there for another 12 months. We have to look at redeploying those individuals into other sectors and other industries. And then do we lose that talent from the offshore wind market because they feel uncertainty?
I mean, Ayleen, how do you see this from the APAC perspective?
The questions is indeed very complex, but if we are talking about from the retention and continuity kind of perspective of the workforce, we definitely can see that the nature of the renewable energy project has cycles, right? And it is creating by nature the uncertainties about the future for the workforce. So for any organization, it's very important nowadays to make sure that there is retention and continuity to maintain the industry knowledge and the expertise to keep it within the industry.
I think this is really important, and it's putting a lot of colour, I think, to this often described phenomenon of avoiding boom and bust cycles through, what we could say a lumpy auction or allocation rounds, or kind of lumpy, for want of a better word, project build out. And when we're thinking about people and how we deploy people, never is the kind of challenge more stark, I would say. So yeah, thank you for putting some colour around that. And we do have a lot of policymakers listening to this podcast. We're informed we have some high profile fans across the globe. So I think for them to understand also the impact that this has on workers in their country.
So just to follow up, actually, I want to dive even a bit of a level down. We're talking about projects and labour force. Like every project is interchangeable with another. That if you've worked on one project, you're fit and ready to work on another project. But I mean, I've worked for 2 of the 3 top Western turbine manufacturers, and I know that the skill set required for example, a Siemens Gamesa project where you've got a direct drive machine versus a Vestas project where you've got a geared machine, or a GE project, that these skill sets require different, like you need to understand different organizations, and then you've got the added complexities of it's a different developer doing a different project with a different demand for their workforce. How do we do we have enough standardization within the industry at the moment to actually ensure that we can just plug and play people from one project to the next? And how do we actually grow the talent pool, and rather than just ensuring that we, company X takes employee from company Y that takes company Y's employee back at the end? How do we actually grow this? So there's a couple of things there. The challenges of different developers and turbine manufacturers and the skill set requires that, and then the sort of stealing of staff from each other as part of that process.
That's good question. So maybe I will just try to answer based on particular example, right? So one of the main skill gaps in offshore wind, what we see in our region, would be high demand, for example, for this high voltage senior authorized person candidates, right? With like 440 kV experience, right? Or the same type of like offshore client representatives. So this type of people actually can support a different global locations, right? So because their expertise required only in a particular stage of the offshore wind development. So it's very easily, and it makes sense to move these people like from one project to another and support different markets.
And Neil, from your perspective?
I think there is a lot of similarities. A foundations engineer, the majority of projects are either jackets or monopiles at this stage. There's a lot of transferable skills there. I guess when you do come into the OEMs and the Vestas experience versus Siemens versus GE is probably where you have the most requirement for a specific skill set.
Yep.
And it's probably around training and companies being open to invest and train and not always looking for that needle. So we have to have someone who has specific experience for a role, and can you train that individual if they've got some similarities in their background?
Yeah, sure. If we look specifically around the compliance related considerations when recruiting and mobilising international talent, do you guys at NES Fircroft have any strategies where, I know people should come to you for a specific advice, but do you guys have any strategies that you could share with our listeners in relation to these, how to handle these compliance related considerations?
I think from my experience, I've worked in different parts of the world. I had quite a number of years experience in the Middle East, and there it was about what I feel is the developers just to take a little bit of time to make sure they're working with a company that has the right local compliance in place, that they can get the visa, that they can payroll you properly, they can take care of local taxes, they do have on the ground support. It is very important that that individual, once they arrive in their country of work, they're not used to it, that they can just go to work, and everything else in the background is looked after compliantly. And it's really important for developers and people moving around the globe to just have that level of comfort that NES Fircroft can provide.
So this is what NES Fircroft actually does for the industry. Like, it's not just about finding the right talent and putting them in front of the organisations. You actually work with those organisations to very specifically get that talent to a functioning workforce.
Indeed, we've invested around the world to make sure that we have a local infrastructure in place so that when a project achieves the financial investment and they need to quickly go to manufacture and fabrication, that we're there to support that worker and that business from day one. That person will fly into a location they may have never been before, and we're there on the ground to help them out with that in-country support.
This is, again, completely left field, but during COVID, where like the world shuts down, and now we've got logistical challenges, like where you've got, you can't sail through the Suez Canal or whatever. There's always stuff that's happening, and there's always and as there's been some, wars and hostilities increase around the world, and there's trade talks, etc. It doesn't sound like things are getting easier to move around the world. It seems to be a bit harder. And I remember, again, when I was in the Vestas organisation during the COVID pandemic, we had sort of technicians in Vietnam that couldn't move, or we had people on the dock and couldn't get things in. Are you guys seeing these sort of risks evolve? COVID was like a definitive risk. I'm not sure how you dealt with the transfer or the mobility issue during COVID, when country X would lock down, then another one, and then that'd open up. I don't know how you did that. That'd be interesting, a case study in itself. But just the general mobility and with this sort of increasing geopolitics that we're seeing around the world.
For example, I had chance during the COVID to support the mobilization of the big group of expats from different locations of the world to enter Taiwan. So I would say, yes, it was an extremely challenging and yet fulfilling experience, being able to support that. But I would say COVID restriction, it was something unique, right? And I really, of course, there is always a risk that it can happen again. But at the moment, what we can see that everything back to more normal in terms of the movements,
Sure.
in terms of the travels.
Okay. Well, actually, I remember my colleagues were, sorry, Neil, I remember my colleagues actually were in Taiwan at the time. They had to do it was more than 2 weeks in a hotel quarantine. I think at the time there was 2 weeks then plus some extra amount or something. And then, we got through it, and you look, there's projects being built during that time, which is a testament to the willpower of the industry, I guess.
Definitely. And as well, I remember that it was even regulation that British nationals were required not just to stay in a hotel, but in a special military facilities in Taiwan for 14 days. And I had a number of contractors sitting there. It was very cold. The food was different, so we had to send them some special blankets to keep them warm. And it was not possible even to order any food via Uber. So it's true, no matter what, just seeing that those projects like Greater Changhua 1 and 2B now up and running, it's incredible despite all these challenges of the COVID.
Yeah, wow, what an experience! It's terrible to have to go through that, but in hindsight, the fact that you've actually helped progress the industry during such difficult times must be pretty rewarding to look back on.
Definitely, yeah. And it's not only that, it was also a lot of, for example, negotiation with the Taiwan labor authorities, because it was a limitation on the number of days you allowed to work offshore when industry practice requires 28 days. Until recently, it was not possible in Taiwan. And during the COVID as well, we were our contractors were required to stay as well after the 14 days of quarantine in a hotel. They were required to stay in a vessel quarantine for 7 days. So yes, it's a learning curve. It's a learning curve, and I'm so happy to see that now 28 days rotation is possible in Taiwan, and it's very rewarding.
And what about from your perspective, Neil?
Nothing as interesting as what Ayleen has had to go through, obviously. But I'm glad that we're out of that COVID period, and it was testament to everyone's hard work that we got through that, and projects have been delivered. I think from our perspective, being local and on the ground, policies change, immigration rules change. We're there to help the developers with that information firsthand, so that you know a employee that needed to mobilize suddenly can't move, and we're there to give that on the ground support and information.
Yep. So just to round out the podcast, I'd like to ask you both, from your perspective, for those companies that are struggling to source talent at the moment, what advice would you give them? Ayleen?
It's going to be recruiting talents with transferable skills, and to have a clear career progression pathways internally in a company. So as well, companies can consider all kind of transition programs for the veterans, for example, right? Because they definitely have a wealth of transferable skills, the one going to be benefiting renewable energy. It's access to the pool of highly skilled female and underrepresented groups. And as well, nowadays, I think that it's also important holistically think about support, providing some support and initiative to attract a new generation to STEM, because definitely renewable energy is rapidly evolving, and innovation is crucial for our for the growth of the industry. So we need to prepare a future generation to join the industry.
Fantastic, and I'm so glad you mentioned the gender balance and also diversity in your answer. It's probably one of the bigger things we should have had front and center at the start of the episode. So I'm glad we could round it out in that respect. Neil, what about you from your perspective?
I mean, I think Ayleen has covered most of the points there. It just is planning and communication. We're going to get to a stage where hopefully we see an improved project pipeline. So then to be able to work with developers, to be able to plan their future workforces in the global locations, attracting the new talent, it's really important. So early planning and communication is going to be really, really crucial moving forward.
Look, thank you very much for that excellent insight. So I'd urge anyone listening to the program, if you do find yourself in need of talent, reach out to the NES Fircroft team. Just listening to them, I can hear that they have a wealth of experience in advising in this area. So please reach out to them if you have any questions. As we round out the podcast, we always ask our guests each week what sort of caught their attention in the industry or globally that maybe be impacting the industry. So, Ayleen, from your perspective, sitting in Taiwan at the moment, what's caught your attention?
A few days ago, Zhongneng project in Taiwan. This is a project, the one developed by CIP and China Steel Corporation, has delivered its first energy. So I think that it's a very great milestone for the market.
Actually, they had the Vestas turbines too, didn't they? They were the ones using Vestas turbines. Yeah.
Indeed, the CIP, this is, I think, that the only developer who's using Vestas technology in Taiwan.
Yeah. I remember that was one of the projects that we were working on back in the day. Anyway, it was great to see first power being produced. I know I have nothing to do with it, but I feel a little bit of pride when stuff like that happens. Neil, what about yourself? What's caught your attention around the world?
Well, I'm hoping in a few weeks' time AR6 will catch my attention and there'll be a project pipeline happening. But I've been out of the office for a couple of days and I've come back to see that Reuters reported that BP are actually going to scale back on their offshore wind developments, which was an interesting read. And whether that is now more of the traditional energy developers scaling back their investment, it's to be seen. But yeah, it was quite big news to come back to the office too.
Yeah, let's hope not. We see that the transition needs everyone to be involved. So it'd be a shame to see if they lose their appetite for offshore wind just when it's really starting to make a huge difference around the world. So I hope that we actually see BP get back in the game. And Matthias, if you're listening, make sure that you fight the good battle for the BP offshore team internally. We'll do what we can to support you. That's great insight. Thanks for that. From myself, again, it's hard to be in GWEC without having the Global Offshore Wind Report. Rebecca did such a great job unpacking that, but I would just remind all listeners to, if you're interested in seeing the latest trends that have emerged over the past 12 months, to please get involved in this. Have a look at the Global Offshore Wind Report, download it, and hopefully pick up a copy. And if you have any questions, either get back to Rebecca or myself on this. But Ayleen and Neil, thank you very much for joining the Offshore Wind podcast. And I wish you a great future in the offshore wind space. And I hope that we can actually start to attract this talent pool that we actually need to get done.
That's good. Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. Much appreciated.
And remember, listeners, if you like what you've heard, please rate and review the show. And always happy to have people refer it to their friends and share it amongst their friendship groups. And if you don't like what you heard, you can always get in contact with the former co-host, David Lenty. I think he's still taking complaints. He does feed them back to us every now and then. So please continue to listening, and we look forward to catching up with you next episode.